Okay, let's actually start working with some real data now. And I think the simplest way to do this, honestly, is just going to be to create a CSV file or two. What I may actually do is I might just jump ahead to the assignment that we have. I think we'll create some CSV data and use that, and that's going to be the simplest way. And I think we'll start by doing this with some students, because that's a pretty straightforward thing to do. So can folks see my screen, by the way? Yes.
Yeah, I can see it.
Awesome, thank you. So I remember we've got students and they've got a first name, they've got a last name. Were there any other interesting properties that we've been using with students as we've been using this sort of student school locker example for our previous work with SQL and databases and stuff?
Like outside of ID, I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. I think we'll do first name, last name, and we'll do email. And if we have time, we might look at like parsing email a little bit. And we can kind of play around with this data a little bit. Alice Waters, alice@gmail.com. And we've got Grace Hopper, grace@gmail.co. Let's do something that's wrong, and we'll see if we can fix it. And we'll do Bob Hope, bob@gmail.com. We'll do Alice Waters, Grace Hopper, just kind of making up some names as we go. Bob Hope. So a very simple students CSV file. I do have the header row, right? And just to recap, all of these are at the same level in our project. And I am going to get rid of a little bit of this code that we're not using at the moment. And before continuing too much, we did have favorite food. And in fact, we do have some data here. So we'll want to recreate this stuff so that we can create a data structure to match so that we have everything in sync. So I think the easiest way to do this is we want a first name to be a varchar. We want last name to be a varchar. We want email to be a varchar, and we've got favorite food. And for, I think, the purposes of this example, I'm not even going to worry about lockers. So I'll just leave that as is.
Do we not have to set the length of the varchar?
It's a good question. I do not think so. We didn't have to for these other varchars. I'm pretty sure what's happening is PsychoPG is making some sort of default varchar length choice for us under the hood. And I'd be curious too with Postgres, we might not even have to specify that. That might have a default value.
I looked that up yesterday. If you do varchar without a value, it treats it as a text data type.
Oh, interesting. That
Which
makes
might be
sense.
the next question, like what is a text data type? But
a text data type is So a varchar, the difference between varchar and text is mainly about memory size. You specify how many characters show up in a varchar. It's still essentially string data, right? Text is much longer, and you can stick a whole bunch of string character stuff in there. And I don't know if you have to specify like a character limit on there. So this starts to matter, you know, if this was the database for the University of California, like Berkeley, where there's a lot of data in there. These days, there's so much memory, all this matters less. You have to get to really big sizes to care about this. But you can imagine how once your data, you have enough data, then you would start caring about how much memory does an individual student row take up. And that's where using varchar for the things that we know are going to be short. Email is a great example. There is no way there's going to be an email over 255 characters. Most first and last names, that's probably safe. There might be someone's name out there that's more than 255 characters, their first name or their last name, that would go to the University of California, Berkeley. I'd have to check, but there's no way that there's going to be an email that long. But then for other things, you can use text and it takes up more memory. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter. Does that make sense? Awesome. And what I'm going to do is this is where using named parameters might work a bit better.
You've got 2 first names, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I needed to change that to last name. And in fact, this is where, let's see, insert into blah, 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 blah. In fact, what I think I want to do is this. This is a little bit of a divergence, but actually this is a good object lesson and kind of the exact stuff that we're talking about. Def create insert student query, first name, last name, email, food. And return, insert into students, first name, last name, email, food. And first name, last name, email, food. And we're going to need 4 of these, I believe. And there's more clever ways to do this using dictionaries, and they show that in the example. And I think, let's see what I'm missing here. Turn insert into students. Let me fix my syntax errors, and then I can just quickly explain what I did. So that looks correct. We've got those parentheses there. We've got those parentheses there. This whole thing probably needs to be an F string. I'm probably not doing this quite right. Yeah, because I pulled it out of the execute. So this is sort of the bad way to do it, but just
I think the error was just the extra parentheses, closing parentheses at the end.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that looks about right. And now these are probably mostly syntax, redefining name first name from outer scope. Right, we can just get rid of all of that. And now I think this error is more of a doc string error. Okay, awesome. And the other advantage, by the way, of writing a little helper method like this is we can test it pretty easily. And in fact, I think I'll put this up here so that it's closer to where I create the student table, because that way, if I modify one, it will help me remember to modify the other. And to very quickly test this, I am simply going to comment out everything and just run this and print this to make sure it's doing what I think it is. Print, let's see, new student equals create insert student, Carol. And this is really using a dictionary here would be better. Once you get past like 2 arguments for a function or a method, it does start to get unwieldy. In the interest of time, I'm just doing it this way. Potatoes. So this should, we open our database connection just to be consistent. Let's close it. And now if I run this, this should just print out the SQL statement that I want to create. Okay, so that looks about right. I'm not quite sure where the parentheses wrapping this came from, but since I'm running this method and then the shell is doing something, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to use it. We'll create some actual SQL data, and then if there's a problem, I'll know that there's actually something I did wrong. So just to recap, all I did here was I just made a method basically as a helper to construct this insert statement to create a student, because I was perpetually modifying this and it was getting a little frustrating, and it makes it a little easier for me as we move forward. And I just want to check in if what's going on here makes sense to folks and if people have any questions about it. Okay, awesome. And in fact, we'll name this student Carol. And now let's go ahead and we execute and commit to create the tables. Let's move this over here to where we're going to want to use it to create our student. Create Carol query. Connection execute. Create Carol query. Commit and close. And so now the test will be running this. And this is, again, because we're creating a little bit of real data here. I added a little bit of complexity. There's a first name and a last name and an email address now. In fact, there should also be a favorite food. And everyone's favorite food is going to be potatoes in the interests of time. So before importing the CSV and working with it and then adding it to Postgres, I just want to update the data model, and I want to do a simple insertion to make sure that everything is working before I add the next piece of the puzzle. And that's why I went through these steps right now. And I'm going to go ahead and run our Python command. And it does indeed look like I have some sort of error. Oh, I froze. One moment, folks. Sorry about that. I heard I might have frozen for a second. The most important thing is to not get intimidated by long error messages. You usually want to look at the very bottom or the very top. And if I had to guess, based on seeing this error message that says bytes expected, all of these different things, and the fact that, let's see, it's tracing back to line 25 in my code, which is where we create the student. My guess is that indeed there's some sort of parentheses here that I've gotten wrong. And in fact, if I look at this, I'm pretty sure that's what's happening, is that I just screwed something up with this helper. So let's see if we can figure out what it is. And in fact, I'm just going to start by simplifying this even more and making it an F string. And doing it this way, the way that you're not supposed to, in theory. And I believe I just need to add some single quotes around these. And I am going to go ahead and print out my query statement, which will also help me see what's going on. And we will run this again. Okay, so good news, that seems to have worked. And this insert statement doesn't have those parentheses. So this is a great example of, there are really two strategies. There are three debugging strategies. One is get up and walk away or talk about the problem to someone else. Another is use the data that you have to analyze the problem, try and figure out what was wrong, and then fix it. Essentially sort of using the scientific method. And I would say the third method, honestly, is without even worrying necessarily about what the problem is, simplify. Reduce the scope of possible things that could be causing the bug. I don't actually know what I did wrong, but I know where it was happening, and I simplified my code, and then that got rid of the problem. I did have a bit of a hint, because when I wrote the first version of this helper method and we printed it out, there were those parentheses, which I didn't expect to be there. That was my first thought when I ran this code and we got this other error, that, hey, I wonder if those parentheses are the problem, especially because this other error message is pretty big. And I think that just drives home the value of really, as often as you can, run your code and have it do something that shows you that things are working as expected. And in that vein, I am going to, in Postgres, confirm that things are working as expected. And voila, they are, which is great. And I just want to pause and check in real quick and see if folks have any questions, or if there's a step that folks would like me to maybe walk through again. Okay, awesome. Now we're going to import our CSV with student data. And then we are going to create student records for each student in the database. And to help with this process, we are going to use the CSV module that is built into Python and thus doesn't require any imports because it's part of the standard library. And this should be the path to where my student's file lives. And the // again says it's a relative path from the directory in which I'm running my Python program, which is the project root. So, and just as a quick reminder, that's what we have in here. The -a shows us the .venv and VS Code's config file. And we can see it here as well in the side view. And we're going to go ahead and use the CSV module. And I think we looked at using this approach with which is a Python context manager. I just want to check in to see if this looks familiar to people as a way to interact with CSVs. Oh, the flag to ignore the first space after a comma. That's a great one. In fact, I should add in a space. I did add a space after a comma. You would run into that. We'll get there in a second. If someone, I think I know what that flag is, but if someone wants to throw it in the chat, that would be amazing, and we'll get there in a minute. And it's normally better to make this more specific, but honestly, this is okay. We'll call this students file. Students reader or row or student in students reader. So first off, again, I just want to run this and make sure that all of this is working. On a practical level, this is not the worst point to start breaking your program into different files, because I don't necessarily want to be rebuilding a database every time I run this. However, the truth is, even if we're doing that, it's not a problem because we've set this up so it gets rebuilt every time. So that's not the end of the world. If we wanted to, we could also just comment all this stuff out. And in fact, I think that's what I'm going to do for the moment, is simply comment all these lines of code out, because all I want to do is confirm that I'm correctly reading my CSV file. The commenting stuff out, it's easy to forget something that might be important. So I think it's a great tool, but one you just have to be a little mindful when using. So whichever way works best for you. But this is an approach, a workflow that I do like, that works pretty well for me. So that's great. We're reading our students correctly. I'm going to go ahead and add that skip initial space equals true argument. And I'm going to run this again to make sure that we don't have any problems. And there is something that it didn't like. I see there's something in the chat about a delimiter. What was that?
I remember putting a delimiter in there to get rid of the commas. I think it was, I forget the syntax exactly, but it was like delimiter equals, and then an open string with a comma in it.
So that is a good point. It's always good to be mindful about paying attention to what the delimiter is in a CSV file. By default, it's a comma. We might end up doing that. I'm just going to do a quick Google search to see how to use the skip initial space argument.
No, I
in here.
think it's the right thing, but isn't that an argument to the reader, or is it like, I don't know, do you put it in the
Oh.
open or do you put it in the reader?
It's a great question. You know
Yeah,
what?
I'm pretty sure it's
VS
a
Code.
go
in the
reader.
Yeah, I think exactly.
Yeah.
I think it goes in the dict reader.
Thank you. 3 cheers for VS
Yeah.
Code. I was trying to put it up there. Space equals true. All right. Yeah, and now let's go ahead and run this. Beautiful. So this is great. We've got students. We're printing students. We've got a student here as a dictionary. And at this point, you know, it might make sense. We could refactor this method to take a dictionary as an argument. To be honest, it's a little bit of 6 of one, half dozen of another of the other, and I don't think it's so critical. So the next step, right, if we want to, is create student statement equals, let me make sure I have my right method name here. Create insert student query. Student. And I think what I will do is make this S. I'll just leave it student just for, it will be long, but that's okay. And actually to make this, let's make this interesting. Let's go back to our CSV file. And let's say that instead of, how can we mix this up so that we're doing something a bit more interesting? We could have it be the name is just one column and we have to break that up. That's not a bad one. I think that's actually a classic challenge, right? Let's do something like this. And let's call this food instead of favorite food. And now if I go back to my Python file, just as a reminder, well, we've got a name, and because as software engineers, part of our job is providing context and the human element and all this stuff, we know that this is the full name with the first name and the last name, and our job is to break it up. And we know that this needs to translate into favorite food. And kind of in a real world context, there's probably some work you'd have to do just to figure all that out. But now that's our job in writing this program, right? Because I can't just pass this stuff into this create insert student query because the formats are different. And I, in fact, don't want to modify this method because I want this to be simple and do one thing, and I might want to use it in other places. And I could write a method. The truth is, since we're only using this code in one place right now, we can just do our cleaning right here. So someone remind me, how do I split a string in Python by the space character?
Isn't it just adding a space into there with those quotes?
Well, let me recap. In fact, what I've got here. Oh, what did this attribute dict has no attribute name? Did I not save the file? Name, email, food. Let's try this again. Give me one moment to make sure I didn't get something wrong here. Oh, name. Oh, I got my Python and my JavaScript confused. Is this the correct syntax for accessing a dictionary value in Python? Yeah.
Yep.
So we have one property on our dictionary that has the name. Our database has first name and last name. So I need to take this string and I need to break it in two. And for the purposes of this exercise, we're assuming that there's not any space in the first name or the last name. So we've got this string, right? We need to turn Carol King into Carol and King. So someone remind me how I split a string in Python.
I think Dave put it in the chat.
It's in chat.
Oh, thank you. Perfect. Split. And we probably need to split on the space, right? And this is going to give us, let's see if this works the way I think it will. Yeah. Is this, let me make sure this is doing what I think it is. Yep. Have folks seen this before in Python, this sort of array destruct or list destructuring approach?
I
Can I get a couple yeses or nos just so I know if this was making sense to folks?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a while ago.
First
but
time?
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll show it both ways quickly, which is always good to do, to be honest. First and last name. So this split command takes this list and students of name, or it takes this string, I'm sorry, separates it based looking by every space character and returns a list. Because we know the name field is only going to have one space between the first and the last name. We know this is going to return us a list of only two things, right? And so if I wanted to, I could do either then first name equals first and last name sub 0, I think is the way to do that. Yeah, and get the last name the same way. There is basically a language shorthand provided, and the term here is destructuring. We're taking this data structure, this list, and destructuring it, and combining those steps of getting a list and assigning the first and second argument to variables, all in one line. And it's not the worst thing to see because this becomes more and more common with JavaScript as well, especially as we get into React. So it's actually quite a good thing to see. So what we're doing is that this returns a list and we're telling Python, whatever that first thing in the list is, assign it to this variable. Whatever the second is, assign it to that. And we can go ahead and grab the other things here. We had email equals student sub email, and then we had favorite food equals student sub food. Create insert student query. We shouldn't have to be named. Last name. Email. And now we can just very quickly test this out. And this looks about right. And so again, there's nothing super crazy here that we're doing. We're just starting to combine more and more of the pieces. So I just kind of want to check in with folks and see how people are feeling about this, if this is useful, if this makes sense, how the pace is, and what questions people have. And we're pretty much we're going to wrap up, I think, in a minute or two, because this is sort of the heart of it. I think because these are sort of the pieces that you can then take and run with.
I just had a quick question about CSV files. So when you're creating your database, you're going to have an initial CSV files, and then as new users come in, you're just going to input like inserts into that database, correct?
That's a really good question. Honestly, in most real world situations, there are so many ways that the data is going into the database. It could be through a form that a user submitted on a website. It could be from a program calling another program. Sometimes maybe there's some initial data that you load with a CSV file. Sometimes maybe the CSV file is a one-off. Text is just such a flexible and useful format, and strings are so useful. And the comma separated value file format, CSV, is so simple that it just keeps popping up over time. And that's why it's valuable to see and use it here and get comfortable with this. Because a lot of this work, other than these two lines of code right here, 30 and 31, the rest of our code doesn't really care where this data comes from. It just cares that it has a list of dictionaries, essentially. So there's a lot of different ways that the data might get into the database, and a CSV file is just one of them. And most likely there will be multiple different ways for data to get into a database in like a production environment and a real application. That's a great question, by the way. And I think the final step here is to make sure this works and run our create student query and uncomment this code. There we go. And I will leave this Carol query because that's actually not the worst thing to confirm that everything else is working. Oh, and that got, there we go. And we are doing a whole bunch of execute statements inside this loop. And we probably want the commit, let's say, to happen outside the loop. Because let's say that this is a new class. So we want to make sure that the whole class is correctly imported into the database. In truth, whether we want to do the commit here or here is a design decision. It's a combination of business logic and engineering that often falls on the software engineer. Maybe we do want to commit for every student, and if we only get half the class in, that's good, and that's what we want, or maybe not. But so this one line of code actually represents, a design decision that has a pretty big effect on the behavior of the program if we ran into an error. And let's see if this thing actually runs. And the test is running our select statement, and it looks great. We've imported a bunch of people. We can see that this one email address is incorrect, which was a flaw I deliberately introduced. Another flaw, I think that's a great example of where we need to start writing more code to do stuff, is maybe there's a student who doesn't have a last name. And then that raises the question of what do we want to do? I don't think the data model requires the last name field, so I think this will work just fine. What would be more interesting, right, is what if our CSV file only had the last name because of some sort of screw up? And dirty data is sort of just the term that we use, is super common, and knowing how to clean it is really common as well. And this is a great example of how we might want our database to allow for no last name for some reason, but at the same time, we might need to check at a level higher in our code, in our Python code, to make sure that a first name and a last name are there, or say, hey, if we only have one name, what do we do with it? And maybe in the University of California, Berkeley database, there is someone whose first name is Turing because that's how that code was written, and whether deliberately or inadvertently, that's how that decision was made. But this is a great example of how real world data is often dirty and messy, and a lot of our job is kind of thinking through how do we clean it up and format it and represent it. So I think I'll just pause here because this is a great stopping point, and this is really all the pieces that you need for the exercise. I think the only thing from the lesson that I didn't really go into more detail on is there's an example of using a sort of doc string style with the 3 double quote comments for a table creation query to make it easier to read. And that can be useful, but that is not as critical, I think. So I just want to check in and see what questions people have or what's on people's minds. Cool. And I know that today ended up being a pretty long day with the lecture as well. Let me go ahead and stop the recording, and then we can chat about it.